let's just get this rolling right here. I honestly do not think that Crawford versus Spence is going to do better numbers than UFC 291. And let me tell you why. For one, let's take a look at the state of where boxing is currently at. What exactly are the big fights out there? Well, number one, Jake Paul is one of them. Who's the other one? Canelo? Yes. A big part of that is because he's had a social media following for the past couple of years, maybe even a decade. And for him to have the notoriety that he has right now is somewhat warranted. But for everybody else that's climbing the ranks in boxing, for example, who among the boxing world, other than the hardcores and within its casual fan base, knew Inoue or Fulton? A fight that happened, by the way, this morning in the Tuesday of July, in the same fight week as Crawford versus Spence and UFC 291. Also, Rizin Fighting Championship in Japan. Another fight that is going on the same date. So in other words, after you're done watching Spence and UFC 291, you can catch Rizin right after, which is going to be playing midnight somewhere in the early mornings of 12 a.m. of July 30th, 2023. But nonetheless, yes, that pay-per-view is going to do a lot better than Crawford and Spence. And I'm talking about the UFC. I'm not sure about Rizin. Perhaps maybe there's a certain level of interest that may happen in the Asian region. Although one would Rizin, you never know, or you can only speculate what kind of numbers they do. Obviously, they're sort of a knockoff from Pride Fighting Championships, from the other one that sort of preceded that, which was Dream Fighting Championships, and all the other top Japanese organizations post Pride Fighting Championships, of which when the UFC had bought them. But make no mistake about it, one of the reasons why this particular card of UFC, which by the way is taking place and out of all places in Utah, I mean, it's a great vacation spot if you're into, let's say, skiing, or if you're into the mountains, you're into high elevation training and things of that nature. But in terms of hot tourist spots in the United States and within the West Coast, it's just not one of those hot prospects in that particular list, especially not for a fight city. But when you got the likes of Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje, two guys that were Khabib's last two fights, and one of them basically finished off McGregor in their last two fights and beat him in the same year, none other than Dustin the Diamond Poirier. You got a name like that, and then you got a name like Justin Gaethje, who, by the way, was headlined during one of the first fights during the pandemic. If you guys remember, the only show that was in town when all the boxing, all the UFC, all the MLB, all the soccer leagues, all the baseball leagues around the region, what was going on? The only thing that was going on was the UFC. And while the UFC was going on, Justin Gaethje was the top dog of that particular segment, because originally Khabib was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson, and then Tony Ferguson was Tony Ferguson at the time, in which he had this hot winning streak going on, 10 fights in, right? So Khabib wasn't able to do it because of the pandemic. And then, by the way, unfortunately, this is when his late father had passed away because of these circumstances that were going on in the world. Not only that, now Khabib was pulled out of that fight, to which it was only going to be none other than Justin Gaethje stepping in. So now that Justin Gaethje steps in, guess what? His whole entire stock blows up, because he was already this exciting fighter that was coming up from the World Series of Fighting, which is now known as the PFL, the same organization that now Francis Ngannou is signed to. And then on top of the fact that he has this big win against Tony Ferguson, when Tony Ferguson was Tony Ferguson during the pandemic. So he's got a lot of clout behind his name. And then Dustin Poirier, we all know the story that he had going on with Conor McGregor. But nonetheless, what we have going on here is two big stars that I think have a bigger name than that of Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence. Now, you may disagree, and perhaps I'm just saying this out of clickbait, but in all honesty, I sort of really believe this in my heart that that could be an absolute reality. An absolute reality that Errol Spence and Crawford got nothing on Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier. Because let's make no mistake about this, right? It's not like Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence are the biggest mic jockers in the world of combat sports. In fact, the opposite can be true. They're very two reserved guys. They're guys that don't really say much. They're two men that have really nothing to say other than what they can show in the ring. Now, as a hardcore boxing fan and as a hardcore fight fan in of itself, man, imagine all this treat that you have going on for the entire weekend. You got Rizin, Crawford versus Spence finally happening. And then you have UFC 291 for the BMF belt with Justin Gaethje and Dustin the Diamond Poirier. And in the co-main event, you got Jan Blachowicz taking on the light heavyweight UFC debut of none other than Alex Pereira, the former 185 champion, just coming off of his loss from Izzy. If you're a hardcore fight fan, you're going to love all this. But you have to understand the whole world is not a hardcore fight fan. The whole world has a lot of things going on in their Saturdays. People are out trying to vacation. People are out trying to hang with their families. People are out trying to go to the parks, trying to go to amusement rides, trying to go to the movies, and trying to do things that have nothing to do with the fight world. So it is the responsibility incumbent upon the promoters of the fight world to get all these people mobilized into these events. And I tell you what, all the hardcore fans are going to watch it, but guess what? Do you think that the average guy that works a 9 to 5 that doesn't really know much about combat sports is really going to care about Spence versus Crawford? Or if they are home at a particular time during the prime time of the main card of whether that would be the boxing card with Spence and Crawford in their main card, and in the main card of the UFC, not even just the main card, the undercard and the prelims of the UFC, once these people are home and they have a choice of either clicking on UFC 291 or Spence versus Crawford, guess who they're going to run to? They're going to run to the UFC because guess what? One of the things that the UFC can absolutely offer is absolute sheer violence. And sometimes they may not be the best technical advice to give to a fighter or to people that are involved in the sport. And especially not great for longevity, but guess what? It's going to make those people click that button one way or another. And if you're not a hardcore fan like myself, who's going to have 2 screens up at that particular night, and maybe even 3 if it bleeds onto the Rizin card, guess what? You're going to have to be convinced which show you're going to watch. If you're not a hardcore fan, you only got one attention span for one of these cards. Which one is it? My bet, I think that the UFC is going to win the pay-per-view numbers that night. But we'll see. That's why they call it the theater of the unknown, right? Enjoy the fights. Enjoy the fights, the multiple fights that are going on. It's going to be a great Saturday night for July 29th, 2023. What a great night, and I can't wait for it.